Uh, just like to welcome everybody to the PITROW Provisional Chapter 88's monthly luncheon. We're virtual once again due to the COVID restrictions, and with that being virtual, we've got to be able to add people from different parts of the country and the continent. We got Gordon McNair from Canada with us, who recently helped Chapter 88 out, donated his time to teach Course 200 for us. So we really appreciate that. We've got somebody from Texas today, which is nice, and Bruce is out in you in Illinois, Indiana, or Kentucky today, Bruce? I think Bruce's mic is working. I think he's in Indiana. Is that correct? Shake your head if that's correct, Bruce. Okay. We're kind of playing the luncheons by ear right now, based off where our speakers are. We've had to reevaluate our speakers for the last quarter of this year because of COVID restrictions and companies not permitting their employees to come out and speak. So we've actually, with the help of the board, we've been able to reschedule October, November, and December speakers than what we originally had planned. With that, just like to introduce everybody to Michael Castle from Phoenix Group, West Virginia. Michael's an established real estate executive. Ron and I had a meeting with him last month to go over his presentation, and we probably could have stayed on for a couple hours. Michael is very knowledgeable on real estate, and he's going to come and give us a perspective of right-of-way acquisition from more of a commercial developer's aspect, I believe. Because we all have our vision of what we're trying to accomplish for our client, and sometimes we fall short of understanding the other side of the coin, even though we say we understand. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. I'd like to ask everybody to mute their mic. We're going to try to keep an eye on the chat. But if you have a question for Michael during the presentation, he is fine for you to interrupt and ask the question. And so at this time, I'm going to mute my microphone, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Michael Castle.
Yeah, Johnny, thank you very much. And thank you to you and Ryan for giving me the chance to speak in front of your group. I really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll get a different look at how I kind of view the world, or most real estate developers are going to view the world regarding, right-of-ways and the impacts that it's going to have on the ground. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage because you guys are the experts, and I'm usually on the receiving end of this. So hopefully that'll give you a little bit of an understanding of how I will kind of approach everything. I have extensive experience in development, brokerage, management, and now the majority of what I do is advisory work. If you don't mind, I'm going to give you screen share and get my presentation up here, and you'll have to deal with me where here's the PowerPoint. Okay, give you a different perspective of everything here. You'll have to excuse I'm not very how do I do how do I get this move ahead? Oh, there we go. Okay, to explain a little bit about advisory work, typically what we will do is we don't look at the world from a transactional basis. We always look at the world from what is the actual impact of this, because whatever you do to the ground is going to have some kind of consequence somewhere down the road. everything that you do, whether it's a right-of-way acquisition or something of that nature, you're doing something to the dirt that's going to change it. I think we covered a couple things where, changing a road or access to a power line or something like that, you're giving something up from that perspective. And I think that's the way most landowners are going to look at that concept of that. The role of the advisor is to kind of look at everything from a wider perspective, from a 20,000-foot view. Okay, and I would think that in your day-to-day work, most people will look at this from a transactional point of view. And if you guys want to jump in and say whether I'm right or wrong, that's perfectly fine here. But I think from when you approach most people, they're going to think you're taking something out of that bundle of rights that I have. You're taking a piece of what I have here and creating a devaluation of the property. And the benefit I'm going to get is just upfront. And I think naturally there is what's the word I want to use? Distrust is probably a bad word, but it's all driven from a lack of knowledge regarding the whole aspect of a real estate transaction. Most people, when they get involved in a real estate transaction, don't necessarily have 100% comfort level to the guy who's the professional. That's why obviously we're licensed and stuff like that. And they have even less knowledge when you start talking about what happens with regarding a right-of-way or an easement. And there's always that elephant in the room that they don't have any control of what it is that they're doing, whether it be through eminent domain. And usually you're dealing with a utility, a Department of Transportation, someone who is seriously a lot larger than you. So right off the bat, you're going to have that kind of, I guess the word is distrust. How I would approach this as an advisor would be to explain everything about what the transaction is going to do, specifically today.
Recording is on.
The downstream impact of that tomorrow. And there's always going to be a downstream impact no matter what you do. All right, so kind of go to the next one here. When you approach a landowner, the first thing that I would want the landowner to know is define the actual ask. What is it that you are requesting from them? Is this a right-of-way? Is it an easement? Is it a temporary construction easement? Is it a fee sale? Is it a lease? That's an important part to it, and I don't necessarily know whether the actual consumer understands all these components to it. So as an advisor, we would want to define exactly what that is, because that's going to have an impact on what the land is and how you would approach developing a strategy to deal with this. And they can be good and they can be bad. I think, Johnny, you had mentioned someone's going to take my ground to make the road a higher speed travel. That's going to have a negative effect. But are there any positives that would come from that? And what we would want to do in the advisement aspect of it is to explain what can happen from here. What are the implications, both short-term and long-term, regarding that? And just by way of example, anytime that you grant this right-of-way, you're going to, it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. Now, from my perspective, the involvement that I've had regarding this stuff has always been kind of to the positive. You understand what it is that you're dealing with, and you can try to work your way around it. What is the best outcome that I can hope for regarding this? We purchased a property in Cheat Lake in West Virginia. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with that, but we knew a road. This is all the aspect of Route 43 that was coming in. We knew that the road and the interchange was going to affect a certain parcel. And we specifically targeted that parcel because this is something that's going to occur. And after we had worked our deal out, then the right-of-way acquisition came in. We actually planned around it and got half of the ground paid. There was another developer that purchased a farm that was going right through where 43 was, staked out some lots regarding it, and he ended up having someone buy him a farm and paying a pretty good windfall profit. Now, there's, in the same breath, that development and that growth basically put a convenience store out of business too. So you're always going to have that pro and con that comes down from that. So you obviously always want to know what it is that you're actually acquiring regarding, what type of thing that it is. And how does it affect what your intentions are to do on the ground, basically. So from that, you're going to want to develop a strategy regarding what is the next what is actually going to occur with the ground. So let's just take, by way of example, you had the quote of the power.
Real quick, Michael, real quick. We got a couple people that haven't muted their mics. If you could mute your mics so we don't have any background noise, that'd be great. Thank you.
You had the concept of the power line. Nobody wants to hear about a power line going through their property. There's the cancer cluster aspect of it. You can't build underneath it. There's all sorts of restrictions attached to it. Is there anything good that will come from what you can do with the ground after a power line is in there? Can you add more? Is there an ability to widen it to the next guy who wants to buy into an already established transmission corridor? Well, I would consider that to be a good thing. Okay, are you developing access to it that now you can have use of ground that there wasn't a road to? Also a benefit. Can you subdivide the lots for hunting cabins and lease it that way? That's possibly a market that would come from that. Obviously the marijuana business is taking off and that grows just about anywhere. Is that something that can be done? What is the utility company going to want to prevent you from doing that? Are they going to require security? Are they going to require, nobody goes on this access? So those are all negotiating points, none of which are monetary. So these are the kind of things that I think that from a development perspective, I would want to know, what is it that you're asking for? Okay, what is my best response to that? And is there a benefit to me that is something that other people aren't looking at? And from that, I know what it is that you're trying to acquire. You're trying to get the ground to put this corridor in. What can I do in addition to whatever you're going to pay me for that particular access or the structure of that access? How can I make that best for the long-term benefits of the ground? So that's kind of an approach to how we would go back strategy-wise to say what's the most appropriate way of going back to you once you've come to me with the original ask. Is there a way I can reposition this to say, okay, I don't want to give you a right-of-way, I want you to buy the ground, or I want to give you a right-of-way, but I need these things in addition to that. And I'm going to use an example of someone not necessarily knowing exactly what they bought or the benefits of it. I'm assuming you guys are familiar with the Rails Trails projects. To me, that was a stimulus for all the railroads, because what they basically gave up was a surface right for a retired rail line that they get a right to take back and use for a rail use anytime they want it in the event that actually occurs. So the people that they were buying it from, they wanted it for certain use, but they didn't really understand all the downstream consequence of what could happen there. And yes, it was a benefit for the public good, but from the rail perspective, all it was money, and they didn't really give up anything. The same thing works in when you're going back to other components of the access limitations, whether it's construction. What is the cost of getting the temporary construction easement versus the actual take of the ground? My property down in Morgantown, right on the waterfront there, they've done 3 different right-of-way acquisitions and I guess land takings, eminent domain. I've actually made $40,000 from the taking of small little pieces of ground, but I've made $50,000 in the temporary construction easements. So I'd look at those things as an absolute betterment to what I had. Right-of-ways that existed in ground, you have to plan around them. You kind of work with what is it that the land gave you? What is the aspect of what you, of what you're actually left with regarding the ground. So I think that from the perspective of approaching any person looking to actually, give up that access to their ground, I think you always want to look at what are the other benefits, what are the other impacts that you should be aware of prior to approaching this. Because a lot of times that can be the bridge to getting them to say, to be a little bit more of a win-win scenario for everyone that's involved. And those are all aspects of the negotiation that we'll use. You're always going to have some kind of shift of the land change. You're always going to have the actual financial aspect of it, but the downstream aspect of it. And then all those negotiations should be based on some type of cost and benefit to both parties. So I'm going to, let me stop sharing here. Open this up to other questions that you might have regarding it or anything else that I can address with that.
I had a question for you, Michael. As far as when you're advising a grantor on a project, have you seen that a commercial property has a little bit more sway and request over a residential owner?
I'd say commercial property is always going to have more sway in a request like that simply because they're a little bit more sophisticated than a residential owner. Commercial property is already evaluated. What does the ground give me regarding its zoning? What is my intention? And what, let's just say specifically, how does that affect what I already have going on the ground or what I have actually planned for the ground? When you look at a commercial property, again, that bundle of rights, I'm looking at the yield of the ground. I'm looking at what I can build on it. What are my setbacks? How does this access to the right-of-way affect the dynamic of just that footprint? Then the next component of it, what are you trying to accomplish with that right-of-way? Okay, as you said, I'm widening this road. Well, you're probably widening the road because you want traffic to move quicker, correct? So if you want it to move quicker, now whatever curb cuts I have, you're minimizing their value because you're going to be moving in and out of them a lot faster. So I've lost some of the luster of a slow road where it's easy to get into and easy to get out regarding that. So that might affect the dynamic of what I do with the ground. Now, the use that you had intended, for example, if it's retail, that's not necessarily good. All right, if it's some other type of use, whether it's office that has less of a pedestrian component to it or a vehicular component to it, it might be, you're going to have more cars traveling past it all the time. So it is always going to affect it. And when you give up that right, you're giving it up today and you're getting compensated for it today. But when you go to transfer that property, and most commercial property is built to be transferred, all right, when you transfer it later, you have to take into account is it going to be a positive or is it going to be a negative impact regarding that? And I'll use an example. We used to manage a mall in Clarksburg, and the mall was anchored by KMart. Now, this is not necessarily a right-of-way acquisition, but it's a cross-easement issue. KMart had announced that they were going to close stores forever and ever and ever, and we had an opportunity to do a pad sale in the area that was in the parking lot. And we were not allowed to pursue it because of a cross easement with Kmart that they said affected their parking totals, which it didn't, but the threat of the lawsuit from Kmart made us not chase $1.5 million deal for an out parcel in that particular parking area, all based on a cross easement. And a year later, they closed the store. So whatever you do will attach to the ground, and most commercial developers are always going to look at what is today, what is tomorrow. But that really wouldn't matter whether you're a commercial, advising on a commercial basis or a residential basis. You always want to know what the downstream impact of that ground is going to be and what is your granting. And, I'm sure that you guys know that when you do start negotiating regarding this, I think we were talking about the greater good component of it. Once you do start negotiating, what is your limitation regarding this? Because if you're talking about a road, you know that they can take it. So there is that fine line with how far do you push them. Typically in my dealings with the Department of Transportation, we've always felt that it was I'm going to call it the 15 to 20% rule, where whatever their original offer was, monetarily, that's as far as you could go. But then they're not necessarily used to the other, let's just say the terms and conditions that you add that were beyond $1 regarding that. So I don't know whether I answered that question right, but that's.
The cross easement you were talking about with Kmart, is that something that is just in the agreement in that particular case at the mall, or would that be a recorded document that a normal title search would pick up?
Yes, it would be in the actual deed and deed restrictions that were placed on that mall. So that would be something that was found there. I'll use another case in point of another property that I developed. There was a gas line easement that ran directly through the property, and I used the gas line easement to actually define how I was going to break the property. I was required, the easement was 10 feet, and my setback requirements were 5 feet on each side of the property. So I built and defined the ground so that easement ran between two different parcels, and 5 feet on each side and 5 feet on the other. And now, if the gas line was not there, I would have changed the dynamic of how big the ground was. But because it was there, and because I wasn't going to move it or pay to relocate it, that's where I defined where the property is, and I planned within that component right there. And I would say that that's something, it's easier to work around the problem than it is to reinvent the wheel.
I have another question as far as your development in a long, if you've got an existing easement, in your experience, is it better as a developer to work around that easement or try to have it relocated, or is that a case-by-case?
That's a case-by-case thing, and it really goes back to what the ask is. What is it that you're going to do? a lot of times with development, you're dealing with properties that are, that you're changing the use of the ground. You know, you buy a farm, you're going to build a subdivision. You know, you buy a piece of, let's just say, infill property. You're going to deal with that in a different way. What are the utilities that run through it? And that becomes the cost benefit thing of what's it cost me to move it and what benefit do I receive from that? And typically in a more established area, that easement's there because there's a line there. So it's not necessarily moving the easement, it's moving the actual physical line. I'm assuming if you could give access in a different manner that didn't reflect how somebody would use the ground, that would obviously be a lot easier than digging a hole and moving a gas line. But working around power lines anywhere you go, that can be a nightmare. You know, we developed a property that was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and it was a dialysis center, and we actually had to buy additional ground because the power line, we couldn't get too close to the power line to actually develop there. And that changes jurisdictionally too regarding that. So I would say that that's a 6-5 in Pick'em. But you would probably, if you were acquiring something and going to develop in something like that, you probably define that in diligence. You know, a lot of times where you modify your plans is it's with a piece of property that you already own. Can I ask, are most of your acquisitions based on roads or utilities or oil and gas? Toss up to everybody.
Yeah, from my end, it's a bit of everything. From my end, it's a bit of everything up here in Canada with what I do.
Okay, so are these the kind of things that do you deal mostly with residential or commercial consumers or both?
With both. But if you don't mind, I'd like to go back and ask a question with regards to the comment you made earlier, when you basically said when transportation or the local municipality, whoever you're dealing with, when they come out and they make you the offer, you're saying normally you're looking at somewhere between 15 to 20% that you can get as additional compensation. So what are some of those things that you'd be looking at as far as additional compensation that would fall within that 15 or 20%?
Okay, regarding the dollar value? Okay,
Yeah, correct.
The dollar value is and the reason why I picked let me kind of just crack into that. The reason why I picked the 15 to 20%, because anything above that, from my understanding, and maybe you can enlighten me, is that it's going to be one thing that goes to court. And the minute it goes to court, typically in the jurisdictions that we deal with, you're required to hire an attorney for that. Mm-hmm. And we all know those guys eat 3 squares a day. Yeah. And so I prefer to avoid that additional expense because that's the law of diminishing returns. But for example, if it's, let's just say road access or something like that, there's a property that I have that's in Morgantown that they just took a little tiny piece. And this is interesting because I've had road construction 3 separate times on the same road in the last 10 years. And each time they take a little tiny piece of the driveway, and the cost of taking the piece of the driveway pales in comparison to the temporary construction easement of them taking it.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, we got a brand new sidewalk, and I had them build in flower beds, something that I wouldn't have spent money on, but they cleaned up an area that I knew we had to deal with. Now the flower beds were in addition. So that the cost of that, obviously restoring the landscape and everything like that, that was part of it. But further down the road, I got another curb cut in, which was a huge value further down because they were, they were trying to increase the speed, but we got to put in closer to a traffic light. Don't ask me why they did this because there's traffic lights every 500 feet on this road. But we We lost one, we got another, and in addition to that, we got another. So that would be an example of it. But from the aspect of, let's just say, a power line, okay, who's going to maintain it? Let me use the example of the power line through the field. Can they build you a road? And if the road, is the road going to be asphalt construction? Is it going to be gravel construction? Are you going to get them to maintain that road? And are you going to be allowed to commercialize or monetize that road? You know, in West Virginia, hunting cabins are big, okay? And there's not a lot of guys that can get it, but you can actually land lease 5, 6, 10 acres. And typically, if you find that running through a lot of the wilderness here, if they would allow you to use that particular ground for access there, they might not want it security-wise, but maybe what you're going to try to negotiate in is a fence, a gate, maintenance, you know, anything that you can look at that might be the potential revenue or right downstream that would be important to somebody else. Those are all things that I'd look at. I'd certainly want to look into a limitation on liability of an environmental impact, stormwater, I mean, you name it. There's a host of things that I would ask for that I don't necessarily think the mainstream person kind of looks at. If you look at it transactionally, there'll always be, it'll always come back to the dollars and the cents. Whereas if you look at it downstream, maybe you can get a little bit more benefit out of it. Because when you do eventually sell that ground, that's what you're going to be left with.
Okay, good. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And going back to the case of the easement with the Kmart,
Yeah.
the value of that capitalized, okay, based on cap rates today, maybe not based on cap rates pre-COVID, because it was a retail deal, would probably have translated to $2.5 million in additional value just from the land lease. So it was a really impactful thing. So in addition to Kmart going bankrupt, it cost them another $2 million.
Well, I was involved with I wasn't personally involved, but I had a friend who was personally involved with a situation similar to that. It was a shopping center up here in Ottawa, and essentially it's one of our large regional shopping centers. And an example you gave is they wanted to create some additional pad space because all of a sudden that was the new trend. So they were looking at creating some opportunities, but when they started to review their leases, they realized that they had some issues with the anchors with regards to what they had to provide them for parking. So they went back to the anchors trying to renegotiate that. And of course, the anchors refused them. Like, these were big chains, just said, no, we're not prepared to do it. But it was really unfortunate because it was a lost opportunity. But once again, who would have thought that, you know, when they did the original deal, because we weren't even thinking about pads, all of a sudden that was a new trend that came about. So
yeah, and when they originally did the deal, their desire was just, if I get this anchor, then I can fill it with the rest of everything.
Yeah. Right.
No one really kind of thought of the dynamic and the change of what retail would be. Can I take a step back into that the temporary construction thing of while that, someone's acquiring their ground, so they're going to do something to it. They're going to, they're going to rip it up. They're going to displace it. There was another guy who was a tenant of mine in another building, but this caused his bankruptcy. He purchased a building actually didn't purchase a building, he leased a space on Penn Ave in Pittsburgh to put a restaurant in. And then they widened the road, or they did something with the sidewalk. They shut basically the construction down and access to his site. He went out of business. It was closed down for about a year and a half. So this guy couldn't even get started. Now, I don't know how that would work.
So you have no patience.
Pardon? Hello? Oh, yeah, so I don't know how that would work, whether it was a right-of-way or something of that nature. But usually when someone takes a road, they're going to disrupt it. They're going to do construction. And so there's always that fight of what kind of impact does this have on my existing businesses? So downstream, that can be a real huge issue.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions before we move forward for Michael? Yeah, Michael.
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I hope I didn't bore you too much with the PowerPoint. But
Mike, I had a conversation this morning from a project I was on a couple of years ago. And I don't know if this is something that you plan to do or work into your agreements as being on the other side. Was that construction ended on this project in 2015. The landowner complained that we did not restore his property correctly. We looked at it in 19. It was well past the budget for the project. We actually turned it over to the in-house land person, and then now this person is suing. Do you set up your agreements that you have a final say or sign off that restoration is complete to your satisfaction, or is that something you just rely on the typical license agreement for temporary construction?
well, it would really, again, depend on the property and what they're taking. For example, the property that I mentioned in Morgantown that they were taking, their improvement was 10 times better than what they were taking, but they didn't do a good job with the landscape regarding that. Now, that was a de minimis amount where, you had the summer that we had, it was very dry, grass wasn't going to grow, so that wasn't worth the chase. But had it been something that was a little bit more, obviously you would have, subject to your approval or reasonable standard and customary language regarding finish, that type of thing. We also have, that particular property was within a municipality, so that they would have to approve that, and it was probably bonded to the construction that they would have done. Now, in other places where they've just been simple severances of ground, and everything was done on a piece of paper. So that's never actually occurred to me regarding something like that. But I can imagine that that's probably, if it were a big enough impact, road access into a higher end shopping center or something like that, I would imagine that would be something that you'd want to put into an agreement, that at least if it's not you, it would be an impartial third party that would be able to approve something like that. And again, since I'm assuming that it works the same on the other side. Nobody wants to go to court. Nobody wants to, because from the corporate side, it's time, it's expense, but the time is probably worth more than the expense. You want to get these things in place so that you can finish your job and get the hell, into the next. So I would imagine that that's always the threat that is behind everyone. And I can't, how many of you have actually been involved in an eminent domain take, whether it's gotten to that point? What kind of cluster is that?
Nobody's happy in the end.
Yeah, I mean,
It impacts the relationship for the easement for operations down the road. And I've had, you guys screwed my grandfather 60 years ago.
yeah,
And they never let that go.
yeah. So in that same, what was the difference between what was offered and what was finally settled on?
I had a pipeline project I was on that I had 3 condemnations out of, a couple hundred tracks. 2 of them dealt with, there was no way we were going to settle on them because they were losing a natural gas tap. But the third guy, it just happened at the wrong time in his life. His wife was sick. His wife passed. He got an attorney from out of the area, and once you get into the attorney, as the land agent, we kind of back up to let the attorneys help take care of it. And then we get right into construction, and we ended up, impacting his property differently than his attorney had promised. And it made for a very stressful construction. And even after the fact, the landowner was extremely sour grapes about it.
Yeah, no one is going to be satisfied when that gets to that point. So, and then attorneys are like nuclear warheads. You have to have them, but nobody wants to use them.
Mm-hmm.
So
I know, like Tim from GAI, when he spoke last year, he talked about some of these access points, the process of going through getting a permit in Pennsylvania, having the entity doing the construction, that cost is a severe. It's a great savings for the landowner, and those road permits that we usually grant for temporary access stay with that property after the fact. I don't know the dollar amount, but it may be similar in West Virginia and other areas, that once you've got a driveway permit, as we call it in Pennsylvania, that stays with that property pretty much from here on out. So that's a huge savings to the landowner to actually get a permitted driveway permit for our temporary access on the construction side. And then the landowner can use that as, an access point for a field or development.
Well, do you explain that to the landowner that this is something that, has a value that is pretty close to six figures right there? No, getting a curb cut or getting access into a piece of ground from, any kind of Department of Transportation, that's worth a fortune. Just the engineering alone is worth a fortune. So that's the other kind of benefit regarding that. And then if they were saying that they're going to lose it, that's obviously an impact that is an insurmountable number.
Mm-hmm.
So all those things when you go into actually value it. And I'm assuming that, if someone presented to you that these are all the things that you're doing to my ground, and this, there's some kind of actuary that can put a number on all those relationships. So if someone took away some of your access to a highway, that would be huge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everyone knows what's. Go ahead.
Do we have any other questions anybody would like to pose to Michael to understand a different perspective of acquisition? Okay, well, we'd like to thank everybody for attending today. It looks like I've got a complete list of everybody that was here. I'll send out a contact sheet like I normally do. Last month I got a little late, of everybody that was in attendance with their emails and their phone numbers and who they're working for. And we'll get more information about February, and then we'll actually, we got new speakers for February or for December and November due to COVID. And we'd just like to thank everybody for attending today. And Michael, thank you for giving us your time today to talk and have a different perspective of how we look at things to the other side of the coin.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Johnny. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Johnny.